Welcome to this video on integrating sources into a text, Harris's moves. This video is part of our series on critical reading. Please be sure to watch the other videos in the series. There are 4 in total. So we want to begin this video by thinking, what do I want to use from the source article in my own writing? How do I know what to take from the source article to put in my own writing? Academic journal articles are full of information, and you'll need to decide how and what to use in your own writing. You might use the source article for information. And here what you'd be doing is extracting information as evidence for a claim, using the information to tell your reader, although I think this, others do too, and there's research that's been conducted on this. Or you might be just giving the information to your reader, this is what's happened. You might also use the source text for the overall message, the outcomes of the research. So what you would do is summarize the main argument, the main message of the paper, and use that as evidence in your own argument. And this is something I've done throughout this series, where I've drawn on sources to substantiate my claims. But I'm focusing on the outcomes of the research, the main points, and not the details. You might also draw on a source text for the way they have theoretically or conceptually understood an approach. So here you're drawing on the way an author has applied a theoretical or conceptual framework. For example, Harris himself uses the concept of rewriting to show you how to move from reading to writing, where you are rewriting the source text. So, using the source text for theoretical insight. You might also use the source text for research methods, on how the research was conducted. For example, other studies have used ethnography in education. So what you're saying is, I think this method is worthwhile, but others have too. And then you could also use the source text for counter-arguments to your own argument. So while Jones suggests that graduate students can get by without reading, I suggest, and then you counter that argument. But Harris has a really useful way of understanding how to use source texts in our writing. He has what he calls moves. These are 4 moves. And the language may seem very strange at first, but you will get used to it. And it's a really useful way to understand how we take something from the source text and use it in our own writing. And I would encourage you to look at source texts to see if others have used this as well. So the first move is coming to terms. And this refers to the process of getting to know content, concepts, and issues. When you come to terms in writing, you restate the work of the source author. You restate the work of the source author without interpreting it. So you're just telling us what is in the paper or what the author says. So coming to terms involves looking at what the writer intended to do, what the writer did, the evidence they've provided, and how they have set up their arguments. One misunderstanding about academic readings is that we all read and receive the same message, when we can interpret that same article very differently. And academic writing is often about explaining what we interpret from that source text. So coming to terms is about that. It's explaining what we understand from that source text and how it relates to our own argument in our own words. Mechanisms for coming to terms are summarizing, where you reduce the paper to a paragraph, paraphrasing, where you change sentence structure and word choice to explain certain things, to explain ideas in the paper. Quoting with exact words and quotation marks, writing descriptions of methodologies and processes. And the purpose is to show that you understand the source text and to explain to the reader what you understand in the source text. Once you're familiar with the substance of the topic, you then move into a process of forwarding. Forwarding is recirculating, repurposing, or recontextualizing meaning from text. So you're using the text in some way. And mechanisms for this are illustrating, using other texts to explain your point through data, scenarios, cases, anecdotes. Authorizing, where you use the author to support your thinking. The quick appeal to another writer as a voice of authority, as Harris says. Borrowing, where we're drawing on terms or ideas from other writers to explain our points. Here we would use other texts by borrowing a term or an idea to relate to our own argument. And extending, developing meaning from a source text to inform our own argument. So we're using the original source text in some way. Countering is the next move, and this is where we acknowledge counter arguments to our own or the source text's move, the source text's author. Countering is a critical part of academic writing. It's not enough to understand the topic and to extend others' ideas. Academic writing always acknowledges that there are people who think in different ways from us. Counter arguments are often not the opposite side of the debate. It's not a head-on argument. Often we add to the conversation or we take it in a new direction. So countering doesn't have to be a full-on argument. It can just mean shifting the debate slightly. So mechanisms for countering are arguing the other side. This would mean taking another side to the one the author is putting forward, or using your source author as a counter to an argument that you are making. Uncovering or explicitly surfacing values. All writers write from a point of view or a perspective which is value-laden. Some writers explicitly state their frameworks and theoretical stances, but others don't. So what is unmarked or unquestioned in the text, Harris asks. This is not easy to do, and it can sometimes only be done by comparing one reading to another. And then the third mechanism for countering is dissenting with concepts, authors, texts, or issues. Harris explains that dissenting often involves working out where there is agreement first. There's a kind of template for many academic essays in which the writer says something like this. Until now, writers on this subject have disagreed on points A, B, and C. However, underlying this disagreement, there is a consensus on point D. In this essay, I will show you why point D is wrong. So dissension is a way of showing your reader that you understand alternative points. A further way of exploring dissension is to use authors from two different perspectives to show the differences between them and how you might align with one of them and take the conversation in a new direction. Questioning could be a way of dissenting as well, posing questions. Taking an approach is the final way of using readings and is the most difficult. This can be done through adopting the approach of an author or developing your thinking in relation to an author. Taking an approach means taking a stand on your argument but taking it further. What Harris means here is that you don't focus on the single ideas from an author, but you use the author's whole intellectual contribution. The mechanisms for taking an approach are acknowledging influences, showing how influential authors have affected your own thinking development and how this has led to your different approach. Turning an approach in on itself, this is questioning in a skeptical way, viewing the author or source text, asking the same questions that the author asks of him or herself. And then reflexivity, which is the critical self-awareness of one's own assumptions and one's own understanding in relation to an author. So critically having a look at yourself, weighing up the options and evidence as well as your own biases and then moving on to a new approach or idea. Harris also mentions the binding that holds these moves together, and he says this is metatext. Now, you might have seen this called signposting or transitions, but these are the sentences that show your reader how you've used sources. So phrases like, in the first section of the paper I will discuss, the purpose of the section is to, that's metatext. And you can use it in relation to authors. I would like to focus on 3 key authors that are relevant to my discussion, for example. So what Harris argues, I've argued throughout this book that the goal of academic writing is to form your own position on a subject in response to what others have said about it. So basically he's saying, although I think this, others have thought that too or thought against it, etc. How can you start using Harris's moves? I would start with coming to terms. Explain to a reader what you understand about the source text. Then move on to forwarding. Use source texts to help your argument. And then use countering. Build a counter argument from a source text to show you understand the alternatives, but in the end still suggesting that your argument is sound. Once you are familiar with those 3 approaches, try taking an approach, which could be a little bit more difficult, but as you become more familiar with these moves, you'll see that you are able to move into this. And look at the source text you're reading. Can you see Harris's moves? Can you see how authors are using their citations? I want to show an example now from Hacking 2002, where all these moves are made in the opening paragraph. And I'm going to read the paragraph for you. The greatest triumphs of propaganda have been accomplished not by doing something, but by refraining from doing. Great is truth, but greater still, from a practical standpoint, is silence about truth. By simply not mentioning certain subjects, propagandists have influenced opinion much more effectively than they could have done by the most eloquent denunciations, the most compelling of logical rebuttals. These comments by Aldous Huxley in his 1946 foreword to Brave New World underscore the power of silence to affect communication. So that's coming to terms because the author hasn't interpreted it in any way. He's just stated what Aldous Huxley said. Traditionally, discourse analysts have tended to ignore such silences, and there you can see is the beginning of his argument. Preferring instead to focus on the words, phrases, clauses, and other linguistic elements that constitute the surface of text and talk. Brown and Yule's definition of discourse analysis is illustrative. We examine how humans use language to communicate, and in particular how addressers construct linguistic messages for addressees, and how addressees work on linguistic messages in order to interpret them. So there he's forwarding. He's building on the statement that he said before, and he's forwarding in that from these particular authors. Yet any practicing discourse analysis will readily acknowledge that communication involves more than linguistic markers. So here he's countering. The yet highlights the countering, and then he goes on to forward his argument. So he shows the counter argument and then he forwards his argument again. So he continues here with some more forwarding, which builds on his argument. And then his last sentence in the introduction, he says, after briefly surveying these 5 types, this article will focus on manipulative silence. So he's not going to focus on the 5 types, he's taking it forward. He's taking it on in a different way, in a new approach. And that's why it's taking approach. So you can see the structure of this opening to his paper, where he comes to terms, he forwards, he sets up his argument, he presents a counter argument, forwards some more to build his argument, and then takes an approach. So what we've done in this video was to look at why we read academic sources, and there are multiple different purposes, and it's important to understand why you are reading this text. And then we moved on to Harris's moves, and we looked at an example of how we can apply Harris's moves. I would encourage you to read Harris's book. I think it's an extremely valuable text. And I want to thank you for watching this video. I hope it helps you in your reading, and I hope you watch the other videos in the series. There are 4 in total.